Nanette and the Fairy. Once, in a far-off land, there lived a poor little girl named Nanette. Her mother and father were dead, and she lived with her stepmother and her daughter. For when Nanette's mother died, her father, hoping to have his child taken care of, had married again. But the stepmother did not care for little Nanette. Instead, she loved her own daughter, Corinne, so much that she was jealous of Nanette because she was so beautiful. So when her husband died, the stepmother took all the money and hid it, for Nanette's father was a rich man. She then told Nanette that they were very poor, and if she stayed in the house with her and Corinne, she would have to do all the work. Nanette did not know what else to do, and so she stayed and did the scrubbing and all the drudgery, while Corinne and her mother sat idle and ordered about poor little Nanette until some nights she fell asleep over her dishwashing. One day, when Nanette went to the well for a pail of water, it was almost dark, and her arms were so tired with hard work she had done that she could hardly wind up the rope that drew up the bucket. When the bucket reached the top of the well, out hopped a queer-looking green dwarf, which so frightened Nanette that she let go of the well handle, and down went the bucket again to the bottom of the well with a loud splash. The little green dwarf, with a funny, squeaky laugh, hopped into the tall grass and shrubs growing around the well, and Nanette, picking herself up, for she had tumbled over in the grass on her fright, started to run home. "Help me! Help me!" Nanette heard someone calling faintly, and it sounded as if the cries came from the bottom of the well. Knowing it was not the strange little dwarf, for she had seen him hop away, Nanette ran to the well and looked down. "Help me! Help me! Draw up the bucket!" came the cry. Nanette was a brave little girl, and though she did not care to draw up any more green dwarfs, she did not want anyone to drown. So she began to turn the iron handle, and slowly the bucket arose from the bottom of the well. But when Nanette, with wondering eyes, saw it come to the top of the well, there was no funny green dwarf in it, or even water. Standing in the bucket was a dainty little fairy, who jumped out as soon as Nanette sat the bucket on the ground. "Where is he? Which way did he go?" she asked the astonished Nanette. Because Nanette was so lost in admiring the beautiful little fairy, she did not reply, and the fairy asked again, "Where did he go?" "The green dwarf, tell me, or I shall never be able to get the queen's pearl." "He hopped into the grass," answered Nanette. "Shall I help you look for him?" But though the fairy and Nanette looked all around the well, the green dwarf could not be found, and at last the fairy said, "It is no use. I shall have to wait until midnight. Perhaps he will come back to the well then." "Are you a fairy?" asked Nanette, who had often heard of them when her own mother was alive, for she had told her stories of the good little creatures who help those who are unhappy. "Oh, yes, didn't you know?" replied the fairy, as though if she thought it strange that Nanette had not recognized her at once. "Come here at midnight and help me look for the green dwarf, and I will reward you." Nanette drew up a pail of water and went back to the house to wait for the midnight hour. And though her stepmother shook her soundly, and Corinne was cross because she had been kept waiting so long for a drink of fresh water, for once little Nanette did not mind it at all. The moon was shining brightly when she tiptoed out of the house and ran down the path to the well, and on the ground, hidden from the well by a small flowering plant, stood the fairy. "It is not midnight, and yet you are here," said the fairy. "If you like, while we wait, I will tell you about the wicked green creature who has stolen the pearl that belongs to the fairy queen." Nanette wanted very much to hear the story, and to have a fairy tell her a fairy story made Nanette forget how tired she was at once. "The green dwarf is a very wicked creature," said the fairy. "He is really a goblin who once stole the black cat of an old forest witch, and she changed him into a small green dwarf. But because he was once a goblin, they are so fond of doing mischief, he cannot help doing things now that bother others, and sometimes he causes a great deal of trouble and unhappiness. And that is just what he has done for our beautiful queen, is sitting at home this very minute weeping because her beautiful pearl is gone, and the little green dwarf has it, because we saw him take it." "Why didn't you stop him?" asked Nanette, thinking, of course, that fairies can do anything. "I will tell you," answered the fairy. "The queen and her fairies were holding a festival one night in a dell, and, as often happens, the goblins found out about it and came peeking about to see what prank they could play to bother us. Now the little green dwarf goes abroad every night to be near his brother goblins, but of course they don't know it was him, nor can they tell him so, because he cannot speak. That was another spell the forest witch threw over him, for of course she was very angry about losing her black cat. So, when at last she found the goblin and the cat which he had carried off to his rock home, she said he should be like no other creature. So she made him smaller than a dwarf and dumb as well. On this night, when he came to the dell, our queen was wearing her beautiful pearl of wonderful tints, which all of her fairies had given her. It is made from the tints of early morning sunrise, and they were given us by sweet Miss Dawn, who runs along the sky just before her brother Mr. Sun gets up. It is in a setting of cobweb silver, and the queen wears it around her neck on a delicate chain made of the same silver cobweb. Now, the goblins know that the queen prizes this pearl very highly, and so one of them slipped up behind her and gave a tug at a slender chain that held it. Before anyone could catch the pearl, it had dropped from the queen's neck and rolled into the grass. The goblins all ran away, and while the fairies were looking for it, this little green dwarf hopped from some place where he was hidden and picked up the pearl and scampered away. We pointed at him our wands, but it was no use. He was under the spell of the forest witch, and we had no power over him." Nanette was very much interested in the fairy story of the lost pearl, but she was curious to know how the fairy expected to get the pearl back if she had no power over the little green dwarf.
Well, you see, all magic spells are broken when the one who is bewitched steps in a body of water,
said the fairy.
and so I am following the little green dwarf about, hoping he will soon do this very thing, which we will give him back his own form. And if he does, I want to be there, for the pearl will drop from his keeping, and if I'm quick enough, I can pick it up and return it to our queen. I saw him hop into the bucket today to sleep, and I flew down the well, clinging to the stones near the bottom, for you know water is something that we fairies never go near if we can help it. There I waited, hoping that the bucket would be dropped into the well. But when it was let down, what did the dwarf do but give the rope a tug, which made you think the bucket was full and you drew it up.
But why did you have to call for help? Asked Nanette. You flew down, couldn't you fly out of the well?
Oh, my dear, we magic folk are strange people,
said the fairy.
As the bucket struck the water, it splashed upon my wings, and I could not use them. That is the reason fairies do not like the water. We are afraid it will disable us, and no matter if we do not have our precious wands or wings must be so, we can use them to get about. If you had not heard my cry, there I should have stayed until I was quite dry again, and though I was not up in time to follow the little green dwarf, I know that this time his home must be near here, for many times I have seen him near this spot.
Just then, Nanette caught sight of something moving in the grass. Look, she said in a whisper to the fairy.
It is the little green dwarf.
The fairy was quick to jump, but so was Nanette.
Little green dwarf, if you want back your own shape, wait and listen, she called.
Little green dwarf squatted on the grass and began to laugh as if he did not believe what he heard. But Nanette, forgetting all about the fairy, told him about stepping into the water. And though he could not speak, the funny-looking little creature bobbed his round green head back and forth. When she had finished speaking,
Now come along to the pond at the end of this garden,
said Nanette, and in the moonlight the little green dwarf followed Nanette while the fairy flittered along beside them. Through the garden, down to the pond. But when he reached it, the little dwarf was afraid to step in, for he was very small, and the pond was deep.
Give the queen's pearl to the fairy, said Nanette, and I will help you. Cling to my dress, and I will dive into the pond. Don't let go, and when I bring you out, you will have your form again.
The fairy told Nanette that no mortal must touch the one who was bewitched when they stepped into the water, or the spell would not be broken. And this was the only way which she could think that would save the dwarf from drowning when he became a goblin again. Though the little green dwarf could not speak, it was plain he could hear, for he had nodded his head when Nanette told him how he could be saved. And now he opened his mouth, and with a tiny green hand he brought from it the lost pearl, and handed it to the fairy. Then, clinging with his two small hands to the skirt of Nanette's ragged dress, they plunged into the water. In a second they were out again, and from Nanette's skirt dropped a little goblin, who, without one word of thanks, took to his small heels and ran, his tiny red cap darting about the bushes as the fairy and Nanette watched him out of sight.
You must not mind the thoughtlessness of the little fellow,
said the fairy.
They never are very grateful. At least they never say they are. But I am sure that Goblin will be very careful not to play pranks on anyone for some time. But I am forgetting to thank you for all you have done for me. And here you are, all wet. But you shall be dry and comfortable.
And as she spoke, the fairy touched Nanette with her wand. From her fell the wet and ragged clothes, and in their place were dry ones, and such a beautiful silk dress as Nanette had ever seen or dreamed of. "Oh, I cannot go home dressed like this," said Nanette. "My stepmother and sister will be very angry when they see this beautiful dress."
"Have no fear, my dear," replied the fairy. "I shall go with you, for our queen will want me to reward you well for the help you have given in finding her precious pearl. Come, let us go back to your home."
Nanette noticed now that it was daylight, and time for her to be getting breakfast for her stepmother and Corinne, and though the fairy was with her, she did not feel at all sure she would not be punished for not having breakfast ready. The fairy disappeared when they reached the door of Nanette's home, but though she seemed to only touch the things, the fire burned quickly in the stove, and the breakfast was on the table by her only thinking about it. But her stepmother and Corinne were cross, and they found fault with everything. "You ought to be well shaken for being so late, you lazy girl," the stepmother said, reaching towards Nanette as she shrank towards the wall of the room. But the stepmother did not touch her, for at that moment the door flew open as if a strong wind was blowing, and whisked the cross woman out of the room and over the trees, while Nanette and Corinne stood looking after her with frightened eyes. "Oh, you bad, cruel girl!" cried Corinne, running towards Nanette. "You are to blame for what has happened to my mother. Your hair should be pulled from your wicked head." But she did not carry out her cruel threat, for she too was blown out of the door by the heavy wind, and off she went over the treetops as her mother had done. Nanette watched Corinne sail away, and then she closed the door, wondering what would now become of her, for her stepmother had said there was no money to provide for her support.
"Do not worry, my little Nanette,"
said the fairy, appearing on the arm of the chair where Nanette was sitting.
"Close your eyes, and we will soon discover where your wicked stepmother hid the money, for I am sure your father left plenty of it."
Nanette closed her eyes. She felt the tiny hand of the fairy against one of her cheeks, and she was not afraid, when suddenly she felt herself going down and down.
"Open your eyes and look," said the fairy. "We are in the cellar of your home,"
she said when Nanette opened her eyes, but did not know where she was.
"This is a cave where all the gold that your father possessed was stored, and he told your stepmother you were to have half of it. But she was so jealous because you were beautiful that she kept it all to herself." "But I don't want it all. Let her have her part," pleaded Nanette. "I do not want any harm to come to her or Corinne." "Have no fear for them," said the fairy. "I have sent them to the land of forgetfulness, and there they will live happily, never remembering that they ever lived in any other place." "But you must have your wish now," said the fairy as she took Nanette out of the cellar. "What would you like? Now that you have plenty of money, you will never want for anything again that money can buy. But you can wish for something you would not be able to have without the help of the fairies." "I would like to see the fairy queen when you return to her the lost pearl," said Nanette. "You shall be present this night at the festival and see it all. At midnight I will come for you."
The fairy disappeared. But that night, when the magic hour came around, she returned, and without touching her feet to the ground, Nanette felt herself sailing over the trees and over rivers and lakes, far, far away, and then down in a mossy dell she saw the land of the fairies. On a throne of silvery moonbeams sat the queen in the midst of her fairies, who were dressed in dainty-colored frocks. The fireflies darting in and out among the trees and around the throne. No one seemed to notice Nanette, though she stood quite near the throne of the queen. And when the fairy, who had lost the pearl, came before her, queen, and knelt, Nanette could hear every word that was spoken. "Here is your precious pearl, dear queen," said the fairy, holding out the jewel. The queen rose from her seat. "You shall have any wish you make, granted for restoring it to me," said the queen as she took it. "You are a brave and good little fairy." The fairy rose. "Dear queen, I cannot claim the reward, nor do I want it, for it is to a little girl named Nanette that you owe the return of your beautiful pearl." And then she told the story while all the fairies listened. When she had finished, the queen said, "All her life Nanette shall be protected from harm, for we will watch over her. She shall be sweet and kind, and everyone shall love her." And with this wonderful promise from the Queen, Nanette was taken back to her home by the fairy to live in comfort and happiness all the rest of her days. And though she never again saw her fairy or any other, Nanette knew they were near her, for the Queen had said she should be protected, and the fairies always keep their promise.